The millionaire's son cruelly humiliated the waitress in front of everyone. A minute later, he fell to his knees because of what his father did. Juliet's hands trembled slightly as she carried the tray of drinks across the bustling dining room of the Blue Orchid. It was another busy night, and the place was packed with the usual crowd, men in tailored suits, women in glamorous dresses, all indulging in the kind of luxury that Juliet could only dream of. She navigated her way through the maze of tables, careful not to bump into anyone. She was used to this routine by now. She had to be. With her mother gone and her father nowhere to be found, it was up to her to take care of her little brother. And this job was the only way to make ends meet. As she approached the table near the corner, she noticed a group of young men laughing loudly, their voices cutting through the gentle hum of conversations. At the head of the table sat Nathan Whitman, the son of one of the city's most influential businessmen. Nathan was tall, with perfectly styled hair, a designer watch on his wrist, and a smirk that never seemed to leave his face. Juliet recognized him instantly. He was a regular at the restaurant, always coming in with different groups of friends, always laughing, always loud, and tonight was no different. She hesitated for a moment before stepping closer, trying to ignore the way his eyes lazily scanned her, as if sizing her up. Juliet placed the tray on the table, her polite smile masking the discomfort she felt. "Here are your drinks. Is there anything else I can get for you?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Nathan glanced at her, then exchanged a look with his friends. He leaned back in his chair, a glint of amusement flickering in his eyes. "Actually, yeah," he said, dragging out his words. "I think you can get us a little entertainment. How about you try smiling for real this time?" Juliet's smile faltered. She wasn't sure if she had heard him correctly, but she could feel her cheeks burning. She tried to keep her composure. "I'm sorry, I didn't catch that." "Oh, you heard me," Nathan said, his tone mocking. "It must be exhausting, carrying that frown around all night. I mean, with a job like this, who wouldn't be miserable, right?" The laughter at the table grew louder. Juliet's heart pounded in her chest as she stood there, feeling like she was on display, a subject of ridicule for Nathan and his friends. She wanted to say something, anything, but she knew better. One wrong word, and she could lose her job, and she couldn't afford that, not when her little brother was waiting for her at home, counting on her to bring back dinner. Nathan wasn't done yet. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, and said, "Seriously, though, you could try putting in a little more effort. You're working at a high-end place like this. You should at least try to look like you belong here." Juliet felt the sting of his words, and she could sense the eyes of the other patrons turning in their direction. It felt like the room was getting smaller, the air heavier, and she wished she could just disappear. She took a step back, clutching the edge of the tray, trying to maintain her composure. "I'm sorry if my service was unsatisfactory, sir," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan's grin widened. "Oh, I'm not complaining. I'm just giving you a tip. You know, maybe with a little more effort, you might actually make something of yourself. Or not. Who knows?" The group erupted in laughter, and Juliet's vision blurred for a moment. She could feel the heat rising in her face, the humiliation settling in her chest like a heavy weight. She wanted to scream, to throw the tray down and run out of there, but she knew she couldn't. She needed this job no matter how much it hurt. As she stood there, trying to keep herself from breaking down, a voice cut through the laughter, calm, yet firm. "That's enough, Nathan." The table fell silent as everyone turned to see who had spoken. Standing near the entrance, with a look of disappointment etched across his face, was Richard Whitman, Nathan's father. Juliet's eyes widened in surprise. She had seen Richard a few times before, but he rarely interacted with the customers, and she never expected to see him intervene like this. Nathan's expression shifted from smug amusement to confusion, then to shock as he realized his father had witnessed the entire exchange. "What are you doing, Dad?" Nathan asked, trying to laugh it off. But there was an edge of nervousness in his voice. Richard took a few steps closer, his gaze never leaving his son. "I said that's enough," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. The room was so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. "This behavior is unacceptable, and I won't stand by and watch you treat someone with such disrespect." Nathan's face flushed, and for the first time that night, he seemed to be at a loss for words. Juliet could hardly believe what she was hearing. Was Richard actually defending her? She had spent so many nights trying to blend into the background to avoid drawing attention, and now all eyes were on her. Richard looked at Juliet, his expression softening. "I'm sorry you had to endure that," he said quietly, then turned back to Nathan, his voice growing stern again. "You will apologize to this young lady, and after that, we're going to have a serious talk." Nathan's eyes flicked between his father and Juliet, and he swallowed hard. "Dad, come on." "Now, Nathan," Richard said, his voice like steel. Nathan hesitated, but the look on his father's face made it clear that there was no way out of this. Reluctantly, he turned to Juliet, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry." Juliet nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She could still feel the eyes of everyone around her, but for once, she didn't feel so small. Richard gave her a reassuring nod, then placed a hand on Nathan's shoulder, guiding him toward the exit. The crowd began to murmur, the tension slowly dissipating, but the impact of what had happened lingered in the air. As Juliet watched them leave, she realized that this night had been different. Maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something new. Nathan's heart pounded as he followed his father out of the restaurant. The cold night air hit his face, snapping him out of the daze he had been in since Richard had confronted him. They walked silently for a moment, with Nathan trailing behind, his mind racing. He couldn't remember the last time his father had spoken to him like that, and certainly not in front of so many people. It was humiliating. When they reached the parking lot, Richard stopped abruptly and turned to face Nathan, his eyes sharp with disappointment. Nathan could barely meet his gaze, still trying to process what had just happened. "What the hell was that?" Nathan muttered, trying to sound defiant but failing miserably. "It was just a joke, Dad. Why are you making such a big deal out of it?" Richard's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he didn't respond. He just stared at Nathan, as if searching for some sign that his son understood the gravity of the situation. But when he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled. "A joke?" he repeated. "That's what you think that was? Humiliating someone, making them feel small, do you think that's funny?" Nathan shifted uncomfortably, his bravado fading. "It was harmless. She's just a waitress, Dad." Richard's expression darkened. "No, Nathan, she's not just anything. She's a person, and she deserves to be treated with respect. Something you clearly don't understand." He took a step closer, his voice lowering but no less intense. "I've watched you for months now, acting like you're better than everyone else, throwing your money around as if it makes you untouchable. Well, guess what? It doesn't." Nathan felt a surge of frustration. "You're overreacting. It's not like I did anything that bad. I don't see why you're blowing this out of proportion." "Overreacting?" Richard's voice was cold, each word precise. "Nathan, I'm ashamed of you. I've worked hard to build this company, to create something that stands for integrity and respect. And tonight, you made a mockery of everything I've tried to teach you." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I won't allow it to continue." Nathan's stomach twisted. "What does that mean?" "It means," Richard said slowly, "that you're done living off of my success. From this moment on, you'll have to earn your own way. No more trust fund, no more luxury apartment, no more credit cards. You're going to learn what it's like to live without all the privileges you take for granted." Nathan's eyes widened in shock. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious," Richard said, his gaze unwavering. "You need to understand the value of hard work, and you clearly won't learn that while everything is handed to you on a silver platter." Nathan tried to think of something to say, some way to make his father change his mind, but he could see it was pointless. Richard's expression was set, unyielding. "Dad, come on, this is ridiculous." "No, Nathan," Richard interrupted. "What's ridiculous is watching my son act like an entitled brat and think that it's acceptable. I've been lenient with you for too long, but that ends tonight." Nathan felt his throat tighten. "So what do you want me to do? Get a job flipping burgers or something?" Richard's eyes narrowed. "Yes, if that's what it takes. You're going to get a job, and you're going to support yourself. I don't care what it is, as long as you do it with respect for yourself and for others." Nathan's mouth opened, then closed again. He couldn't believe this was happening. Just a few hours ago, he had been laughing with his friends, enjoying a carefree evening, and now everything was falling apart. "This is insane," he muttered, more to himself than to Richard. "I suggest you get used to it," Richard said, his tone softening slightly, "because this isn't going to change. And the sooner you accept that, the sooner you can start to make things right." Nathan's head spun as he tried to wrap his mind around what his father was saying. Make things right? What did that even mean? He had no idea where to begin, and part of him didn't want to. He had always lived a certain way, and the thought of giving that up, of having to struggle like everyone else, was terrifying. As they stood there, the silence between them heavy and tense, Richard glanced back at the restaurant. "Do you know why I was there tonight, Nathan?" Nathan shook his head, confused. "No? Why?" "I was meeting with potential business partners," Richard said. "People who are interested in investing in our company, people who value integrity, humility, and respect. And you nearly ruined it all by showing them exactly the opposite." He took a deep breath, his shoulders stiff. "I've spent years building this company from the ground up, and I won't let your arrogance tear it down." Nathan didn't know what to say. He felt like he was sinking, the reality of the situation finally hitting him. He had messed up, and not just a little. His father wasn't just angry. He was disappointed, and that hurt more than Nathan wanted to admit. Richard's gaze softened. "Just a little. Nathan, I'm giving you this chance because I still believe you can be better than this, but you need to want to change. You need to understand why what you did tonight was wrong." Nathan swallowed hard, trying to hold back the sting of tears. He had never seen his father like this, so resolute, so certain. I didn't mean to. I didn't think it was that big of a deal." "Well, it is," Richard said. "And until you realize that, you're going to keep facing consequences like this." He stepped back, giving Nathan one last look. "Now, go home. Tomorrow you'll start figuring out your new life. And I hope you use this opportunity to prove that you're capable of more than what I saw tonight." Nathan wanted to argue, to say something that would make his father reconsider, but no words came. He just stood there, feeling lost and alone as Richard turned and walked away, leaving him to grapple with the harsh reality of what was to come. The night was quiet, and for the first time in a long time, Nathan felt a cold sense of dread wash over him. He had no idea what he was going to do, but he knew one thing for certain. His life was about to change, and there was no going back. Nathan awoke the next morning in a daze, the events of the previous night still echoing in his mind. For a moment, as he lay in his bed, he almost believed it had all been a bad dream, but the sight of his phone, lying silent and untouched on the nightstand, was a harsh reminder that it was all very real. No missed calls from his father, no texts telling him everything was back to normal. Just silence. As he sat up, he glanced around his spacious bedroom, the expensive decor and luxury furniture now feeling out of place, almost foreign. It was like he was seeing everything for the first time, and none of it brought him the comfort it once did. He reached for his phone, hesitated, then finally opened it to check his bank account. His heart sank when he saw the balance. The massive sum that had always been there, a cushion that allowed him to live without worry, was gone. Nathan stared at the screen, hoping it was a mistake. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. His father didn't make empty threats. He had always been a man of his word. And last night, he had made it very clear. Nathan was on his own now. He tossed the phone back onto the bed and buried his face in his hands, trying to figure out what to do next. A few hours later, he found himself standing in front of his closet, staring blankly at the rows of designer clothes. Normally, he would have picked out something stylish and expensive without a second thought, but now, it all seemed pointless. He grabbed a plain t-shirt and jeans, something simple, and got dressed. He didn't know where he was going, but he couldn't just stay in his apartment all day, wallowing in self-pity. As he stepped outside, the city seemed different. The streets were just as crowded, the traffic just as loud, but Nathan felt disconnected, like he was watching everything from the outside. He wandered aimlessly for a while, ending up in a small cafe not far from his apartment. He ordered a coffee and sat by the window, staring out at the busy street, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his chest. Every sip of coffee felt bitter, a stark contrast to the sweetness of the life he was used to. He kept glancing at his phone, half expecting a call from his father saying this was all just some elaborate lesson, and he could go back to how things were. But the phone never rang. Nathan realized he was on his own, truly on his own, for the first time in his life. After a long, restless day, he returned to his apartment, only to find a letter waiting for him. He hesitated before opening it, knowing it could only mean more bad news. The letter was from his father's office, confirming what he already knew. His accounts were frozen, and all financial support had been cut off. If he wanted to maintain any semblance of his old lifestyle, he would need to find a way to earn it himself. The words stung, but the final line was what hit him the hardest. Consider this your opportunity to prove that you can stand on your own, without relying on my name or my money. Nathan crumpled the letter in his fist, feeling a mix of anger and frustration. How was he supposed to do that? He had never had to work a day in his life. Everything had always been handed to him, and now he was expected to figure it out, just like that. It felt impossible. But as he stood there, staring at the crumpled letter, he realized he didn't have a choice. His father had given him an ultimatum, and he couldn't ignore it. Over the next few days, Nathan tried to come up with a plan. He reached out to a few friends, hoping they could offer some advice or connections. But it was clear that many of them weren't interested in helping him now that he wasn't Nathan Whitman, the son of Richard Whitman, the millionaire. The rejections stung, each one a reminder of how shallow his relationships had been. Desperate, he scrolled through job listings on his phone, feeling a sense of dread as he realized how underqualified he was for most of them. It wasn't that he wasn't capable, he had attended some of the best schools after all, but he had never taken anything seriously. He had always assumed he wouldn't need to. Now, looking at listings for entry-level positions, he realized just how little he had to offer. Eventually, he stumbled upon a job posting that caught his eye. It was for a delivery driver position. It wasn't glamorous, but it was something he could do without needing a lot of experience. Nathan hesitated, his pride screaming at him to keep looking, to find something more respectable. But he knew he didn't have the luxury of being picky. He needed to start somewhere. Taking a deep breath, he clicked on the link and filled out the application. The process was quick, and within a few minutes, he had submitted it. He felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety, knowing that he had taken a step, however small, towards something different. It wasn't the life he wanted, but it was the life he had to accept now. The next morning, he received a call. It was from the delivery service, offering him a chance to come in for an interview. Nathan almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Him, interviewing for a job as a delivery driver. But he knew he couldn't turn it down. He agreed to the time and place, hung up, and stared at the phone for a long moment, trying to wrap his head around what was happening. When the day of the interview arrived, Nathan found himself standing in front of a small, unassuming office, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never been this nervous before, not even during the most high-stakes events of his old life. As he walked inside, he was greeted by a receptionist who led him to a small, cramped office in the back. The manager, a middle-aged man with a kind face, asked Nathan a few simple questions. If he had a valid driver's license, if he was familiar with the area, if he could handle long hours. Nathan answered as best as he could, trying to sound confident. But inside, he felt like a fraud. This was not where he thought he would be, not in a million years. At the end of the interview, the manager nodded and offered him the job. Nathan accepted, still in a state of disbelief. As he left the office like a small, part of him felt relieved. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something he hadn't even realized he needed. For the first time, Nathan understood what his father had meant. He had been given an opportunity, not just to work, but to learn, to grow. And despite everything, despite how lost he felt, he was determined to see it through. Juliet had just finished her shift at the Blue Orchid, her feet aching from hours of running back and forth, taking orders, and managing the endless stream of customers. It had been a long night, and she was looking forward to heading home, where she could finally relax, even if just for a few hours. But as she collected her things from the staff room, the restaurant manager, Mr. Green, approached her. "Juliet," he said, his tone softer than usual. "There's someone here who wants to speak with you before you leave." Juliet's heart skipped a beat. She immediately thought of the incident from a few nights ago, when Nathan had humiliated her in front of the entire restaurant. She feared it was another complaint, or, worse, that she was about to lose her job. "Who is it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Mr. Whitman, Mr. Green replied, and Juliet felt her stomach twist. Richard Whitman. What could he possibly want with her? She had barely exchanged a word with him that night. And yet, he had stepped in to defend her. Now, he wanted to talk to her directly. She followed Mr. Green to the private dining area where Richard was waiting, seated at a small table near the window. The room was dimly lit, giving it an air of quiet sophistication. And for a moment, Juliet felt out of place, like she didn't belong there. But she took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and approached him. "Good evening, Mr. Whitman," she said politely, standing a few feet away. "You wanted to see me?" Richard looked up from the papers he had been reading and smiled. It was a warm, genuine smile, nothing like the condescending smirk she had seen on Nathan's face. "Yes, Juliet, please have a seat," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. She hesitated but did as he asked, her mind racing with possibilities. Maybe he wanted to apologize again on Nathan's behalf. Maybe he was going to offer her some kind of compensation for the embarrassment she had endured. Whatever it was, she wasn't sure she was ready to hear it. "I'm sure you're wondering why I wanted to speak with you," Richard began, his tone calm and measured. "I won't take up too much of your time, but I felt it was important to talk to you directly." Juliet nodded, unsure of what to say. She had always heard stories about Richard Whitman, how he was a shrewd businessman, someone who didn't tolerate nonsense. But the man sitting in front of her didn't seem intimidating. In fact, he seemed almost kind. "I was here the other night when my son behaved inappropriately," Richard continued, his expression growing serious. "I want to apologize for his actions. I know he already apologized, but I feel it's important for you to hear it from me as well. What happened was unacceptable, and I'm deeply sorry you had to go through that." Juliet was taken aback. She hadn't expected this. "Thank you, Mr. Whitman," she said quietly. "I appreciate it." Richard nodded, then leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment. "Juliet, I've been coming to this restaurant for years. I've seen how hard you work, how dedicated you are. You always carry yourself with grace, even when the situation is difficult. It's not something everyone can do." Juliet felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. She wasn't used to receiving compliments, especially not from someone like Richard Whitman. I just try to do my best," she replied, unsure of how else to respond. "That's precisely why I'm here," Richard said, leaning forward. "I see potential in you, Juliet. More than just a waitress. I see someone who is intelligent, capable, and driven. I believe you have what it takes to do much more than this." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "I'd like to offer you a position in my company." Juliet blinked, certain she had misheard him. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm serious," Richard said, his tone firm. "I'd like you to come work for me, in a role where you can grow, learn new skills, and build a future for yourself. I understand if it seems sudden, but I'm offering you this opportunity because I believe you deserve it." Juliet was stunned. She had expected many things from this conversation, but this was not one of them. She struggled to find the right words, her mind spinning. "But why me? There are so many people out there who are more qualified." Richard smiled again, this time with a hint of amusement. "Maybe, but none of them have shown me the same resilience and determination that you have. You've faced adversity and handled it with grace. That's a quality I value in my employees, and it's one I think will serve you well if you choose to accept this offer." For a moment, Juliet didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to accept immediately, to seize this unexpected chance to change her life. But another part of her hesitated. She had spent so long relying on herself, and the idea of stepping into a new world, one where she didn't know what to expect, was daunting. What kind of position would it be?" she asked, buying herself a little more time to think. "It would be an entry-level role in our administrative department," Richard explained. "You would start by learning the basics, but there would be plenty of opportunities to advance. I won't lie to you, it will be challenging, but I have a feeling you're up for it." Juliet's mind was racing. This was a chance to escape the endless cycle of shifts at the restaurant, to finally have the kind of stability she had always dreamed of, but it also meant stepping into a completely new environment, one where she would have to prove herself all over again. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "I'm honored, really, but I'm not sure if I'm the right person for this." Richard's expression softened. "I understand your hesitation, Juliet. It's not an easy decision, and I'm not asking you to make it right now. Take a few days to think about it. Talk it over with your family if you need to, but know that this offer stands, and I'm confident that you're capable of more than you realize." Juliet nodded, her heart still pounding. She couldn't believe this was happening. She had spent so many years feeling stuck, struggling to make ends meet, and now, out of nowhere, she was being given a lifeline. "Thank you, Mr. Whitman," she said finally. "I'll think about it." "That's all I ask," Richard said, standing up and extending his hand. "Whatever you decide, I wish you the best of luck." Juliet shook his hand, still feeling like she was in a dream. As she left the restaurant that night, her mind was filled with a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this was the opportunity she had been waiting for, an opportunity to finally change her life, and her brother's, for the better. Nathan's alarm blared at 6:30 a.m., jolting him awake. He groaned, slapping at the clock until it stopped, then lay back on his bed, staring at the ceiling. This was his new reality: early mornings, a cramped apartment, and a job he never thought he'd have to take. It was his first day as a delivery driver, and he felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. He dragged himself out of bed, threw on his uniform, a plain shirt with the company logo, faded jeans, and a cap, and grabbed a quick breakfast of cold cereal. There was no time for the usual luxuries he used to indulge in. No leisurely coffee made by a barista. No browsing through social media before heading out. Just a quick meal, then straight to work. As he walked to the small office where he'd be picking up his delivery route for the day, he tried to ignore the creeping sense of dread. The streets were already bustling with people, everyone moving with purpose, and Nathan felt out of place, like a kid on his first day of school. He arrived at the office, where the manager from his interview, a man named Carlos, greeted him with a nod. "Morning, Nathan," Carlos said, glancing up from his clipboard. "You ready for your first day?" Nathan forced a smile. "Yeah, I guess so." Carlos handed him a small device that would guide him through his route, along with a list of packages to deliver. "It's pretty straightforward. Just follow the route on the screen, deliver the packages, get signatures if needed, and move on to the next one. Any questions?" Nathan shook his head, though he had plenty. He wasn't sure how he was going to handle this, but he didn't want to seem incompetent. Carlos gave him a reassuring pat on the back. "You'll be fine. Everyone's nervous on their first day. Just don't overthink it." Nathan nodded and headed out to the company van, feeling the eyes of a few other drivers on him. He could tell they were curious, maybe even a little amused, to see someone like him starting at the bottom. He climbed into the van, started the engine, and pulled out of the lot, his heart pounding. The first few deliveries went smoothly enough, but it didn't take long for things to go wrong. He missed a turn, ended up stuck in traffic, and then struggled to find the right entrance to an office building where his next delivery was scheduled. By the time he finally made it inside, he was late, and the receptionist greeted him with a look of impatience. "Finally," she said, signing for the package without bothering to look at him. "We've been waiting for this all morning." Nathan bit his tongue, resisting the urge to snap back. Instead, he forced a polite smile and mumbled an apology before hurrying back to the van. As he climbed back into the driver's seat, he could feel his frustration boiling over. This was exactly what he had been afraid of, being treated like he didn't matter, like he was just another nobody. The rest of the day didn't get any easier. By late afternoon, he was exhausted, his back aching from lifting heavy boxes, his hands sore from carrying packages up and down stairs. He hadn't realized how physically demanding this job would be. And by the time he finished his last delivery, he felt like he could collapse. As he drove back to the office, Nathan's thoughts drifted to his old life. He missed the comfort of his apartment, the convenience of having everything at his fingertips, the way people used to treat him with respect. But now, all of that was gone, and he was left to fend for himself. He knew this was his father's way of teaching him a lesson, but it felt more like a punishment, a reminder of everything he had lost. When he finally parked the van and handed the keys back to Carlos, the manager gave him a sympathetic look. "Rough day?" Nathan nodded, too tired to say much. "Yeah, you could say that." Carlos chuckled. "Don't worry, it gets easier. You'll find your rhythm, and before you know it, you won't even have to think about it." Nathan managed a weak smile, but he didn't share Carlos's optimism. As he left the office and walked back to his apartment, he wondered how long he could keep this up. This wasn't just a job, it was a test, one he wasn't sure he was capable of passing. Meanwhile, Juliet was adjusting to her own set of changes. After her meeting with Richard, she had spent the next few days thinking about his offer, weighing the pros and cons. It was a big step, one that could change everything for her and her brother. But it also meant stepping into the unknown, and that terrified her. She had always played it safe, choosing the familiar path because it was easier, because it was what she knew. But now, she had a chance to break free from that. Her shifts at Hut the Blue Orchid felt different since Richard's visit. The other staff had heard rumors about what happened, and some of them treated her with a newfound respect. Others seemed jealous, whispering behind her back, speculating about why she had been singled out by someone like Richard Whitman. Juliet tried to ignore it, focusing on her work and trying to clear her head. One evening, as she was finishing her shift, she found herself lingering in the staff room, staring at the business card Richard had given her. She knew she had to make a decision, and the longer she waited, the more uncertain she felt. Finally, she pulled out her phone and dialed the number, her hands shaking slightly as she pressed it to her ear. "Mr. Whitman's office," a voice answered. "How can I help you?" "Hi, this is Juliet Reyes," she said, her voice barely steady. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Whitman if he's available." "Just a moment, please," the receptionist replied, and Juliet could hear her heart pounding in the silence that followed. A few seconds later, Richard's familiar voice came through the line. "Juliet, it's good to hear from you," he said warmly. "Have you made a decision?" Juliet took a deep breath. "Yes." I have. I'd like to accept your offer." "That's wonderful news," Richard said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "I think you've made a great choice, Juliet. We'll set up a time for you to come by the office, and we'll get everything sorted out. I'm looking forward to seeing what you can do." As she hung up the phone, Juliet felt a mix of relief and nervous anticipation. This was it. She was stepping out of her comfort zone, taking a chance on something new. It wasn't just about the job. It was about proving to herself that she could do more, be more. She thought of her brother, how hard she had worked to take care of him, and how this new opportunity might give them both a better future. That night, as she walked home, she felt lighter than she had in a long time. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, it felt full of possibilities. She had no idea what awaited her at Richard's company, but she was ready to find out. And as she looked up at the city lights, twinkling against the dark sky, she allowed herself to hope that things were finally changing for the better. Nathan's new life had quickly settled into a monotonous routine. Wake up early, throw on his uniform, and spend the day driving around the city, delivering packages to people who barely acknowledged him. It was a far cry from the life he once had, where every day was a string of leisurely brunches, social events, and indulgent evenings. Now, his days were filled with traffic, heavy lifting, and the occasional rude customer who treated him as nothing more than a nuisance. One afternoon, after a particularly exhausting shift, Nathan decided to drop by his father's office. He hadn't seen Richard since the night at the Blue Orchid, and he thought maybe, just maybe, if he showed that he was trying to adapt, Richard might ease up on his punishment. He felt a mix of apprehension and hope as he entered the sleek, towering building, his father's empire looming over him like a constant reminder of what he'd lost. As he stepped into the lobby, the receptionist looked up and offered a polite smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Whitman," she said. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see my father," Nathan replied, trying to sound casual. "Is he in?" "He's in a meeting at the moment," she said, glancing at her screen. "But you're welcome to wait if you'd like." Nathan nodded and took a seat in the lobby, glancing around at the familiar surroundings. He had been here countless times before, but it felt different now. He no longer belonged in this world of polished floors and expensive suits. After a few minutes, he noticed a familiar face walking through the lobby, carrying a stack of files. It was Juliet. For a moment, Nathan thought he was imagining things. What was she doing here? He watched as she approached the receptionist, exchanged a few words, and then headed toward the elevators. Before he could think it through, he stood up and called out her name. "Juliet!" Juliet turned, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw him. "Nathan, what are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," Nathan said, walking over to her. "I didn't know you worked here." Juliet hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the encounter. "I just started," she said, her voice guarded. "Mr. Whitman offered me a job and I accepted." Nathan blinked, processing her words. "My father offered you a job?" "Yes," she replied, her tone firm. "He thought I could do more than just wait tables, so he gave me an opportunity." She paused, then added, "Why do you sound so surprised?" Nathan felt a surge of conflicting emotions. He had been struggling to adjust to his new reality, and now he was learning that his father had gone out of his way to offer Juliet a chance to move up in the world. Part of him felt a flicker of resentment. "So, you're just going to take advantage of it, then?" he said, his words sharper than he intended. "Get cozy with my dad and make the most of it." Juliet's expression hardened, and she took a step back, as if he had slapped her. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Nathan said, his frustration bubbling over. "I know he feels guilty about what happened, but that doesn't mean you get to use it to your advantage." For a moment, there was silence. Then Juliet shook her head, a look of disbelief crossing her face. "Wow, Nathan," she said quietly. "I didn't realize you could be this petty." Nathan's eyes widened, taken aback by the calmness in her voice. He had expected her to get angry, to snap back at him, but instead, she just seemed disappointed. "I'm not being petty," he said, but the words felt hollow even to him. "I'm just saying—" "You're just saying what?" Juliet interrupted, her eyes flashing with a mix of hurt and defiance. "That I'm not allowed to take an opportunity because it came from your father. That I should stay stuck, struggling, because you're having a hard time accepting the consequences of your actions." She took a step closer, her voice steady and clear. "I didn't ask for any of this, Nathan. I didn't ask for your father to offer me a job, but when he did, I accepted it because I need this. I need to build a better life for myself and my brother. And if that means working hard and proving myself in a place like this, then that's what I'm going to do." Nathan felt a sting of shame at her words, but he didn't know how to respond. He had been so focused on his own struggles that he hadn't considered what this opportunity might mean for Juliet. I didn't mean to—" "Yes, you did," she said, cutting him off. "You meant to make me feel small, just like you did at the restaurant. But it didn't work then, and it won't work now." She held his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "I don't know what's going on with you, Nathan, but whatever it is, it doesn't give you the right to take your frustration out on me." Nathan opened his mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, he knew she was right. He had been lashing out, trying to find someone to blame for the mess he was in, and Juliet had been an easy target. But seeing the strength in her eyes, the determination that he lacked, made him realize just how misguided he had been. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "I shouldn't have said that." Juliet's expression softened, but she didn't let him off the hook that easily. "No, you shouldn't have," she said, "but I'm not going to stand here and let you drag me down because you're struggling. I have my own battles to fight, and I don't need your negativity getting in the way." Nathan felt a pang of guilt, and he realized just how much he had underestimated her. Juliet wasn't just some waitress he could push around. She was strong, resilient, and determined to make something of herself, no matter what obstacles stood in her way. "Look," he said, trying to find the right words, "I didn't mean to make things harder for you. I'm trying to figure things out myself, and I don't know how to do this." Juliet studied him for a moment, then nodded, her expression softening slightly. "I get that," she said, "but you're not going to figure it out by tearing other people down. You need to find a way to deal with this, Nathan, and if you need help, ask for it. Don't just assume you're the only one struggling." Nathan didn't know what to say. He had never been good at asking for help, never had to, really. But now, standing in front of Juliet, he realized how alone he felt and how much he had to learn. I'm trying," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Juliet nodded, and for the first time, she offered him a small, reassuring smile. "Good," she said, "because I think you can do better than this. I hope you do." With that, she turned and headed for the elevator, leaving Nathan standing in the lobby, her words echoing in his mind. As he watched the elevator doors close behind her, he felt a strange mix of emotions: shame, regret, and a flicker of hope. Maybe she was right. Maybe he could do better. But if he was going to prove that, he would have to start by changing the way he saw the world and himself. For the first time, Nathan understood that this wasn't just about surviving without his father's money. It was about learning to be a better person, to earn respect instead of demanding it. And as he walked out of the building, he realized that if he was going to make that change, he needed to start now. Nathan spent the rest of the afternoon wandering the city, replaying his conversation with Juliet over and over in his head. Her words had hit him harder than he'd expected, and he couldn't shake the feeling of guilt that clung to him. He had been so wrapped up in his own problems that he hadn't considered how his actions might affect others. It was something he was starting to realize he did often, and it was a bitter pill to swallow. As the sun began to set, he found himself standing outside his father's office building again. He wasn't sure why he had come back. Maybe he was hoping for a chance to talk to Richard, to explain himself, or maybe he just needed some kind of direction. Before he could second-guess his decision, he pushed open the door and headed inside. The receptionist glanced up, a bit surprised to see him return. "Mr. Whitman is in his office now," she said. "Would you like me to let him know you're here?" Nathan hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, please." A few moments later, he was walking down the familiar hallway to his father's office, feeling a mix of nerves and apprehension. When he reached the door, he took a deep breath and knocked softly. "Come in," Richard's voice called from the other side. Nathan opened the door and stepped inside, finding his father seated behind his desk, reviewing a stack of documents. Richard looked up, his expression unreadable, and gestured for Nathan to sit down. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Richard asked, his tone neutral. Nathan took a seat, unsure of how to start. I wanted to talk," he said finally, "about everything that's been happening." Richard leaned back in his chair, studying his son carefully. "Go on." Nathan shifted uncomfortably, trying to find the right words. "I know I haven't exactly been handling things well," he began, "and I know I've made a lot of mistakes. But I'm trying to understand why you're doing this. I mean, I get that you want me to learn a lesson, but I don't know, it feels like you're pushing me away." Richard's gaze softened slightly, and he let out a sigh. "Nathan, this isn't about pushing you away. It's about helping you see the world through a different lens. I know you think I'm being harsh, but there's a reason for it. One I don't think I've ever fully explained to you." Nathan frowned, puzzled. "What do you mean?" Richard stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. For a moment, he was silent, as if lost in thought. Then he turned back to Nathan, his expression serious. "You know I built this company from the ground up. But what you don't know is how hard it was to get here, and the things I had to go through to make it happen." Nathan listened, intrigued. His father rarely talked about his past, and he realized now how little he actually knew about it. "I wasn't always the man you see today," Richard continued. "I grew up in a small town, in a house barely big enough for the 5 of us. My parents worked themselves to the bone just to put food on the table, and there were plenty of nights when we went to bed hungry. I started working when I was barely a teenager, taking whatever odd jobs I could find. It wasn't glamorous, and it sure as hell wasn't easy, but it taught me something valuable, something I've been trying to teach you." Nathan's eyes widened. He had never imagined his father coming from such a background. To him, Richard Whitman had always been this powerful, successful figure, someone who had everything figured out. The idea of him struggling, working menial jobs, was hard to picture. Richard continued, his voice calm but firm. "I had to learn how to navigate the world without any safety net. I knew that if I wanted to get anywhere, I had to work for it, and that meant making sacrifices and facing setbacks. There were times when I thought about giving up, but I couldn't afford to, so I kept pushing, kept fighting, and eventually, I built something I could be proud of." Nathan felt a pang of shame as he listened. He had spent his entire life taking things for granted, while his father had fought for everything he had. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because I didn't want my past to define your future," Richard said, his eyes meeting Nathan's. "I wanted you to have opportunities I never did, but I see now that I made a mistake by shielding you from the realities of life. I gave you everything without making you earn it, and that's why you've never understood the value of hard work or respect." Nathan swallowed, the weight of his father's words sinking in. "I guess I've always just assumed things would be easy for me because they always have been." "That's precisely the problem," Richard said. "You've been living in a bubble, Nathan, and bubbles burst. I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing it because I want you to grow, to become the kind of person who can stand on his own 2 feet, no matter what life throws at him." Nathan felt a tightness in his chest, a mix of gratitude and guilt. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't realize how much you had to go through, or how much I was taking everything for granted." Richard nodded, his expression softening. "I know, and that's why I'm giving you this chance. But you need to take it seriously, Nathan. This isn't just about surviving without money. It's about learning to respect yourself and others, no matter their background. Look at Juliet, for example." Nathan's head shot up at the mention of her name. "Juliet?" "Yes," Richard said. "She's someone who has had to fight for everything she has. She didn't get any shortcuts, and yet she carries herself with grace and dignity. That's why I offered her a job here, because I see potential in her. The same potential I hope to see in you one day." Nathan was quiet for a moment, absorbing everything his father had said. He thought about his encounter with Juliet earlier, the way she had stood up to him without flinching. She was stronger than he had given her credit for, and now he understood why his father respected her so much. "I don't know if I can be like that," Nathan admitted. "I've never had to work that hard for anything, and now I just feel lost." "You're not lost, Nathan," Richard said gently. "You're just finding your way, and it's okay to struggle. It's okay to make mistakes, but what matters is how you learn from them and how you pick yourself up after you fall." Nathan felt a flicker of hope, something he hadn't felt in a long time. "So, what do I do now?" "You keep going," Richard said. "You keep working, keep learning, and most importantly, you don't give up on yourself. It's going to be hard, but if you can face this challenge head-on, you'll come out stronger on the other side. And when that day comes, I'll be right there, proud of the man you've become." Nathan's throat tightened, and for the first time, he felt a sense of clarity. Maybe he wasn't as helpless as he thought. Maybe there was still a chance for him to prove himself, not just to his father, but to himself. "Thank you, Dad," he said quietly. "I'm going to try, I promise." Richard smiled, a rare, genuine smile that Nathan hadn't seen in a long time. "That's all I ask, son." As Nathan left the office, he felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He didn't have everything figured out yet, but for the first time, he had a direction and a reason to keep pushing forward. And that, he realized, was a start. Nathan's days began to take on a new rhythm. The early morning alarms, once a jarring reminder of how far he had fallen, now felt like a call to action. Each day, he climbed into his delivery van, set his route, and started working. And slowly, things began to change. The tasks that had seemed so overwhelming at first, navigating the busy streets, dealing with customers, lifting heavy packages, became easier as he found his rhythm. He was still tired by the end of the day, but there was a new sense of accomplishment that came with it. He had never noticed how diverse the city was until he started delivering packages. He found himself going into parts of town he had never set foot in before, delivering to small businesses, family homes, and busy office buildings. He met people from all walks of life: shop owners, secretaries, elderly residents, and gradually, he realized that each of them had their own stories, their own struggles. They weren't so different from him, and he wasn't as different from them as he had once believed. One afternoon, as he was making a delivery to a bustling neighborhood grocery store, he found himself helping the store owner, an older woman named Mrs. Ramirez, carry boxes inside. She thanked him warmly, chatting about how her son was supposed to help that day but had been called in to work at his second job. Nathan listened, nodding as she talked about how hard it was to keep the store running, especially during tough times. "People think it's easy running a place like this," she said, wiping her brow. "But it's not. You have to be there every day, even when you're tired, even when you don't want to be. But it's worth it, because it's yours, and you built it with your own hands." Nathan was struck by her words. He had never thought about work that way before, as something you could take pride in, even when it was hard. But he could see the pride in Mrs. Ramirez's eyes. And for the first time, he wondered if maybe that was what his father had been trying to teach him all along. As he continued with his deliveries, Nathan started to pay more attention to the people he interacted with. He made an effort to smile, to be polite, to ask how their day was going. At first, it felt awkward, like he was playing a role he wasn't used to. But gradually, it became more natural. He learned the names of the receptionists at the offices he visited regularly, and he started to look forward to his daily chats with Mrs. Ramirez and the other small business owners who had become familiar faces. One day, as he was leaving an office building, he saw a man struggling to load a stack of files into his car. Without thinking, Nathan walked over and offered to help. The man looked surprised but grateful, and together they managed to get everything loaded. "Thanks, man," the man said, clapping Nathan on the shoulder. "Most people would have just walked by." Nathan smiled. "No problem. Have a good one." As he walked back to his van, he realized that the old Nathan, the one who would have scoffed at the idea of manual labor, who never would have stopped to help a stranger, was slowly fading away. He was still figuring things out, still struggling in many ways, but he was beginning to see the world differently. He was starting to understand what his father had meant about earning respect, not just from others, but from himself. Meanwhile, Juliet was settling into her new role at Richard's company. The first few weeks had been a whirlwind of training, learning new systems, and adjusting to an environment completely different from the restaurant. She felt out of her depth at times, surrounded by people who seemed so confident and polished. But she reminded herself that she was there for a reason. Richard had seen something in her, and she was determined not to let him down. One afternoon, she was working on a spreadsheet when Richard walked into the office. She looked up, surprised, and quickly set her work aside. "Mr. Whitman," she said, standing up. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Please, Juliet, call me Richard," he said with a smile. "I just wanted to check in and see how you're settling in. It's been a few weeks now. How are you finding things?" Juliet hesitated, then nodded. "It's different, but I'm learning a lot. I'm still getting used to everything, but I think I'm starting to find my footing." Richard's smile widened. "I'm glad to hear that. You're doing well, Juliet. It's not easy to step into a new environment like this, but you've handled it with grace. I knew you would." Juliet felt a flush of pride at his words. "Thank you. That means a lot." Richard nodded, then added, "I've noticed you've been staying late some nights. Don't push yourself too hard. It's okay to take things one step at a time." Juliet hesitated, then decided to speak up. I'm trying to make sure I do everything right. I want to prove that I can handle this." "You already have," Richard said gently. "And I didn't bring you here because I wanted you to prove something. I brought you here because I believe in your potential. Don't forget that." As he left, Juliet felt a sense of reassurance wash over her. She had spent so much of her life feeling like she had to prove herself, to fight for every bit of respect she got. But here, for the first time, someone had given her an opportunity and believed in her without needing her to prove anything first. It was a new feeling, and she was beginning to understand just how powerful it could be. That evening, as Juliet was leaving the office, she ran into Nathan in the lobby. She almost didn't recognize him at first. He was in his delivery uniform, a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. When he saw her, he gave a sheepish wave. "Hey," he said, his voice a little uncertain. "How's it going?" Juliet raised an eyebrow, surprised to see him there. "Nathan, what are you doing here?" I had a delivery," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "Thought I'd stop by and say hi." Juliet studied him for a moment, then smiled. "Well, hi." Nathan hesitated, then added, "Listen, I wanted to apologize again. For what I said last time, it was out of line and I'm sorry." Juliet's expression softened. "It's okay, Nathan. I appreciate the apology. I can see you're trying, and that means a lot." Nathan felt a wave of relief at her words. "Thanks. I'm still figuring things out, but I'm trying to be better." Juliet nodded, her smile warm. "That's all anyone can do, right? Keep trying." As they stood there, for the first time, Nathan didn't feel like he was speaking to someone who was judging him or looking down on him. He felt like he was talking to someone who understood, who had been through their own struggles and come out stronger. It was a small moment, but it gave him hope. As he walked away that evening, Nathan realized that he was starting to see Juliet in a different light. She wasn't just the girl he had embarrassed at the restaurant. She was strong, determined, and kind, everything he wanted to be. And maybe, if he could keep learning, keep growing, he could be someone worthy of her respect. Richard Whitman's company was abuzz with activity as the staff prepared for the upcoming corporate event. It was a big night, one that would bring together investors, business partners, and key clients, all in the hopes of strengthening alliances and securing future deals. For Juliet, it was her first taste of just how high stakes the corporate world could be. She had been assigned to help with the planning, coordinating everything from catering to seating arrangements, and while it was overwhelming, she felt a rush of excitement. She had thrown herself into the work, wanting to prove to herself, and to Richard, that she could handle it. She worked late into the evening, double-checking every detail, ensuring that everything would run smoothly. But as the day of the event approached, she began to feel the pressure mounting. What if something went wrong? What if she made a mistake? 2 days before the event, Juliet was finalizing the guest list when Richard called her into his office. "I've been hearing great things about how you've been handling everything," he said as she entered. "I knew this would be a big responsibility, but you've done an excellent job." Juliet felt a wave of relief. "Thank you, Richard. I'm trying my best." Richard's eyes twinkled. "I can see that. But I also want you to make sure you enjoy the event. You've worked hard, and you deserve to be proud of what you've accomplished." Juliet nodded, though she still felt a bit nervous. "I just want everything to go well." "It will," Richard assured her. "And I have a little surprise for you. I've arranged for you to have a more prominent role during the event, something that will give you a chance to showcase your hard work. I'll fill you in on the details tomorrow." Juliet's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea what Richard had planned, but the thought of stepping into a more visible role made her both excited and anxious. She wanted to live up to his expectations, but she couldn't help but worry about what it might entail. The next day, Richard revealed his plan. Juliet would be responsible for introducing some of the key speakers at the event, including Richard himself. It was a significant responsibility, and Juliet felt a mix of pride and fear as she prepared her notes. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, but she was determined to rise to the occasion. Meanwhile, Nathan had been trying to find a way to reconnect with his father. His conversation with Richard had been eye-opening, and he had been working hard to prove that he was serious about changing. He had started showing up at his father's office more often, asking questions about the business, trying to understand how things worked. At first, it felt awkward, like he was intruding on a world that no longer belonged to him, but gradually, Richard began to open up, sharing insights and advice. One afternoon, as Nathan was finishing a delivery near his father's building, he saw Richard stepping out of the office. Nathan hesitated, then approached him. "Hey, Dad," he said, trying to sound casual. "Do you have a minute?" Richard glanced at his watch, then nodded. "Of course. What's on your mind?" "I heard about the big event you're hosting," Nathan said, shifting his weight. "I was wondering if there's any way I could help. I know I'm not really part of the company, but I'd like to be involved, if that's okay." Richard studied his son for a moment, then smiled. "Actually, I was hoping you'd ask," he said. "There's a lot of setup involved, and we could use an extra pair of hands. It's not glamorous work, but it's important." Nathan felt a flicker of hope. "I'm up for it. Whatever you need." "Good," Richard said. "Come by the venue tomorrow, and I'll introduce you to the team. It's going to be a long day, but I think you'll find it worthwhile." The day of the event arrived, and the venue was transformed into a scene of elegance and sophistication. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the room, and the tables were set with pristine white linens and gleaming silverware. Juliet arrived early, dressed in a sleek, simple gown that made her feel more confident than she had in a long time. She walked through the space, checking the final details, and took a deep breath. This was it, the moment she had been preparing for. As guests began to arrive, Juliet busied herself with last-minute tasks, ensuring that everything was running smoothly. She greeted the speakers, confirmed their schedules, and kept an eye on the seating arrangements. Despite the chaos, she managed to keep her composure, and as the evening progressed, she found herself settling into her role. Nathan was also at the venue, dressed in a suit for the first time in months. He had spent the day helping with the setup, moving tables, arranging chairs, and coordinating with the catering staff. It was hard work, but he felt a sense of satisfaction that he hadn't experienced in a long time. He knew he was still a long way from earning his father's full trust, but being there, contributing to the event, made him feel like he was taking a step in the right direction. As the main part of the event began, Juliet took her place on the stage, her heart pounding. She could see the sea of faces in the audience, all watching her, and she had to force herself to breathe. This was her moment, and she couldn't afford to falter. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. "On behalf of Mr. Richard Whitman and our entire team, I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's event. We are honored to have you here, and we hope you enjoy what we have prepared for you." The applause was polite, but it was enough to boost her confidence. She continued, introducing each of the speakers, including a few prominent business figures. As she spoke, she noticed Richard standing near the edge of the room, watching her with a proud smile. It gave her the strength to keep going, and by the time she finished her introductions, she felt like she had accomplished something significant. Nathan watched from the back of the room, his heart swelling with admiration. Juliet looked poised, confident, and completely in control, and he couldn't help but feel a pang of envy. She had found a way to thrive in this new environment, while he was still trying to find his footing. But instead of feeling bitter, he felt inspired. If she could do it, maybe he could too. The highlight of the evening was Richard's speech, and as he took the stage, the room fell silent. He spoke eloquently about the company's achievements, the importance of collaboration, and the future he envisioned for his business. But then, to everyone's surprise, he paused and turned his attention to Juliet. "Before I conclude, I'd like to acknowledge someone who has played a crucial role in making tonight possible," he said, gesturing to her. "Juliet Reyes joined our team not long ago, but her dedication, hard work, and grace under pressure have been nothing short of inspiring. She reminds me of why I started this journey in the first place, and I am grateful to have her with us." The room erupted in applause, and Juliet felt her cheeks flush as she smiled. She hadn't expected to be singled out like this, and she felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. Richard's words meant more to her than she could express, and as she looked out at the crowd, she saw Nathan clapping, a warm smile on his face. For Nathan, seeing Juliet receive that recognition was a revelation. He realized that true success wasn't about status or wealth. It was about making a difference, earning respect, and being someone people could rely on. And for the first time, he understood what his father had been trying to teach him all along. As the event continued, Nathan approached Juliet, who was still basking in the glow of Richard's praise. "You were amazing up there," he said, his voice sincere. "Really? I'm glad I got to see it." Juliet smiled, her eyes softening. "Thank you, Nathan. That means a lot." And in that moment, there was a quiet understanding between them. They were both on their own journeys, both trying to prove something to themselves and to the world, and maybe, just maybe, they could help each other along the way. The evening of the event continued with a sense of celebration and camaraderie, but for Nathan, there was a growing restlessness. He had watched Juliet shine on stage, confident and composed, and it had stirred something inside him. It was as if a mirror had been held up, showing him everything he wasn't, but wanted to be. The realization brought both a sense of clarity and a nagging fear. He knew there was one more thing he needed to do, something he had been avoiding for too long. Nathan glanced around the room, catching sight of his father speaking with a group of investors. For a moment, he hesitated, but then he saw Juliet talking to a few guests, her smile radiant, and he felt a surge of determination. This was his chance to make things right, not just with her, but with himself. He couldn't keep running away from his mistakes. He approached the stage, his heart pounding. The band was playing softly, and the guests were engaged in their conversations, barely noticing as Nathan picked up the microphone. But when he tapped it, sending a soft echo through the room, the chatter died down, and all eyes turned to him. For a brief, terrifying moment, he considered backing out. But then he saw Richard watching him, a mix of curiosity and concern on his face. And he knew he had to do this. "Good evening, everyone," Nathan began, his voice shaking slightly. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's something I need to say." A murmur went through the crowd, and Richard took a step forward, as if ready to intervene. But Nathan raised a hand to stop him. "Please, just let me speak," he said, his voice steadier now. "I promise this won't take long." Juliet, who had been at the edge of the room, froze when she heard Nathan's voice. She turned, her eyes widening as she saw him standing on stage, holding the microphone. She had no idea what he was going to say, but she could see the tension in his posture, the way he gripped the mic as if it was his lifeline. "I know a lot of you know who I am," Nathan continued, looking out at the sea of faces. "And I know that a lot of you have probably heard about the less than great things I've done. I'm not proud of it, but I need to own up to it. Especially to one person who I hurt deeply and who deserves an apology." The room was silent now, all eyes fixed on him. Nathan took a deep breath, his gaze finding Juliet's across the room. "Juliet, I'm talking about you." Juliet felt her breath catch, her heart pounding as she met his eyes. She had never expected this, especially not here, in front of everyone. "A while back, I did something terrible. I humiliated you, and I treated you like you didn't matter," Nathan said, his voice cracking slightly. "I was arrogant, selfish, and cruel, and there's no excuse for it. I hurt you, and I'm sorry. I'm truly, deeply sorry." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I thought I was better than you, but the truth is, I didn't know anything. I didn't know what it meant to work hard, to struggle, to earn respect. And you've shown me what real strength looks like. You've shown me what it means to face adversity and still stand tall." Juliet felt her eyes welling up, but she didn't look away. She could see the sincerity in Nathan's eyes, and it was clear that this was not easy for him. She had seen glimpses of change in him over the past few weeks, but hearing him say these words, in front of so many people, felt like a turning point. "I can't undo what I did," Nathan said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "But I'm trying to be better, and I want you to know that I respect you, and I admire you, more than I can say. I'm grateful for the chance to learn from my mistakes, and I hope you can forgive me." There was a long, heavy silence. Then, slowly, the room filled with the sound of applause. It started softly, a few people clapping tentatively, but soon it grew louder, more genuine. Richard stood in the back, his expression unreadable, but there was a glint of pride in his eyes. He had hoped Nathan would find a way to make amends, and seeing his son take responsibility like this was more than he could have asked for. Juliet wiped a tear from her cheek, then stepped forward, walking through the crowd until she was standing at the foot of the stage. Nathan watched her approach, his heart hammering in his chest. He had no idea what she was going to say, but he knew he deserved whatever response she gave him. Juliet looked up at him, her expression soft but firm. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "It takes a lot of courage to stand up here and say what you did, and I appreciate it." She hesitated, then added, I forgive you, Nathan. Not because what you did was okay, but because I can see you're trying to change, and I believe everyone deserves a second chance." Nathan felt a wave of relief wash over him, and for a moment, he could hardly believe what he was hearing. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That means more than you know." As Juliet turned to leave, the room erupted into applause again, louder this time, and Nathan felt a warmth spread through his chest. It wasn't just about the apology. It was about the acknowledgement, the acceptance. For the first time, he felt like he was starting to understand what his father had been trying to teach him. Richard approached the stage, his eyes glistening with a mixture of emotions. He took the microphone from Nathan and turned to address the room. "I'm proud of my son," he said simply. "I've watched him struggle, make mistakes, and find his way back. And tonight, he showed me something I've been waiting to see for a long time: humility and the courage to admit when he's wrong." He glanced at Nathan, a small smile playing on his lips. "That's not easy, and it's not something you can learn overnight. But I believe Nathan is on the right path, and I'm excited to see where it takes him." The room filled with applause once more, and this time, Nathan couldn't help but smile. He knew he still had a long way to go, but this felt like a new beginning, a chance to start fresh. He stepped off the stage, his heart lighter than it had been in months. As the evening continued, Nathan found Juliet near the refreshment table. She was talking to a few guests, but when she saw him, she excused herself and walked over. "I meant what I said, you know," she said, her eyes warm. "It takes courage to do what you did tonight." Nathan smiled, feeling a newfound sense of confidence. "I'm just glad you were willing to listen." Juliet nodded, then tilted her head slightly. "So, what's next for you, Nathan?" Nathan thought about it for a moment, then shrugged. "I'm not sure yet, but I think I'm ready to find out." Juliet smiled, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "Well, whatever it is, I'm sure you'll figure it out. Just keep doing what you're doing, it seems to be working." As they stood there, surrounded by the hum of conversations and the clinking of glasses, there was a sense of quiet understanding between them. They were both on their own paths, but for the first time, it felt like those paths were beginning to align. And maybe, just maybe, they could walk a little further together. The event gradually wound down, but the warmth and optimism it left behind lingered. Nathan felt different as he helped with the final cleanup, rolling up sleeves that once never saw a day of work. There was a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. The applause, Juliet's forgiveness, and his father's words had given him a clarity he had desperately needed. As the last few guests trickled out of the venue, Nathan found Richard standing by the entrance, talking to a few colleagues. When their conversation ended, Nathan approached him, unsure of how to express everything he was feeling. "Dad," he said, his voice steady, "I just wanted to say thank you for everything." Richard turned to face him, his eyes softening. "There's no need to thank me, Nathan. You did this yourself. You chose to change, to stand up and own your mistakes. That takes courage, and I'm proud of you for it." Nathan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I still have a lot to learn, but I want to keep trying. I want to prove that I can do this." "And you will," Richard said, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "It's not about being perfect, Nathan. It's about making progress, little by little. You've taken the first steps, and that's what matters." As they stood there, Nathan felt a sense of connection with his father that he hadn't felt in years. He realized now that Richard's tough love hadn't been about punishment. It had been about pushing him to grow, to find his own way. And though the path had been difficult, it had brought him to a place where he could finally see himself clearly. "Do you think there's a place for me in the company?" Nathan asked tentatively. "I mean, I know I'm not ready yet, but maybe someday?" Richard's expression softened even more. "There's always been a place for you, Nathan. But it's not about where you start. It's about what you make of it. If you're serious about this, I'll help guide you, but you'll have to earn it, and that means starting from the ground up." Nathan nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I'm ready." Richard returned the smile, a rare, proud expression that lit up his face. "Then let's get to work." The next few weeks marked a new beginning for Nathan. He continued his job as a delivery driver, but he also started spending afternoons at the company, shadowing different departments, learning the ins and outs of the business. It was challenging, and there were moments when he felt completely out of his depth, but each day he learned something new, and with each lesson, he grew a little more confident. He also made a point of reconnecting with people he had drifted away from, friends who had once been mere social acquaintances, colleagues he had barely acknowledged before. Nathan reached out to them, not with the old arrogance, but with a genuine interest in understanding who they were. It was a slow process, but it felt real, and that made all the difference. Juliet, meanwhile, had continued to thrive in her role at the company. Richard had been true to his word, offering her opportunities to grow, and she had seized every one of them. She was now handling projects that were far more complex than when she had started, and her confidence had only grown. She found herself enjoying the work, not just for the sense of accomplishment, but for the way it allowed her to envision a future where she and her brother could finally have the stability they had always needed. One evening, after a long day at the office, Juliet decided to stop by a small cafe near the company's headquarters. She ordered a coffee and settled by the window, watching the city's evening bustle. She had barely taken a sip when she saw Nathan walk in, still in his delivery uniform, looking pleasantly surprised to see her. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, nodding toward the empty seat across from her. "Sure," Juliet said, smiling. "Long day?" "You could say that," Nathan replied, taking a seat, "but it's getting better." They chatted for a while, swapping stories about their day, their challenges, and the small victories they'd managed to pull off. It was easy, natural, and Nathan found himself appreciating how far they had both come. He hadn't realized how much he needed this kind of connection, someone who understood, who wasn't afraid to call him out but was also willing to give him a chance. As their conversation drifted, Juliet leaned back and looked at him thoughtfully. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" she said. "About making things right." "I am," Nathan said, nodding. "It's not easy, and I still mess up sometimes, but I want to keep trying. I want to prove to myself, and to my dad, that I can be better." Juliet's smile was warm, and she reached across the table, placing a hand over his. "I think you already are, Nathan. And I think your dad sees that too." Nathan felt a warmth spread through him at her words. "You've been a big part of that, you know, more than you probably realize." Juliet shrugged, a playful glint in her eyes. "Well, I guess I have a talent for straightening people out." Nathan laughed, and for the first time, it wasn't tinged with the bitterness or defensiveness that had once marked their interactions. It was genuine, and it felt good. "Yeah, I'd say you do." The weeks turned into months, and the changes in Nathan became more apparent. He was more focused, more attentive, and most importantly, more grounded. Richard had given him a part-time position at the company, starting in a lower-level role, and Nathan had embraced it, eager to learn. He still had his delivery job, and balancing both wasn't easy, but he found that he enjoyed the challenge. It made him feel like he was earning his place, step by step. Juliet's career continued to grow as well. She had been promoted to a project coordinator position, and she was excelling. Richard often sought her out for her insights, and her colleagues respected her for her hard work and innovative ideas. She was no longer just the girl who had been humiliated by a spoiled rich kid. She was someone who had built her own success, and she was proud of it. One afternoon, Richard called Nathan and Juliet into his office. "I've been watching the two of you," he said, his tone light but sincere. "And I'm impressed. You've both come a long way, and I'm proud of how far you've grown." Nathan and Juliet exchanged a glance, a mixture of pride and gratitude washing over them. "There's a new project I'm launching," Richard continued, "and I'd like the two of you to work on it together. It's going to be a bit of a trial by fire, but I think you're up for it. What do you say?" Juliet grinned, nodding enthusiastically. "I'm in." Nathan felt a surge of excitement. "Me too." As they left Richard's office, they couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. This was the beginning of something new, a partnership, a challenge, and perhaps even a new chapter in their relationship. They had both been through so much, and they knew there would be more hurdles to come. But for now, they were ready to face them, together. As they walked out into the late afternoon sun, Nathan turned to Juliet, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I used to think that the only way to prove myself was by being the best, by showing off how much I had. But now, I think it's about doing things that matter, things that make a difference." Juliet smiled, linking her arm with his. "You're right, Nathan, and I'm glad you're starting to see that." Together, they stepped forward, ready to face whatever the future had in store. For Nathan, it was a journey of redemption and growth. For Juliet, it was a journey of realizing her potential and building a life she could be proud of. And for both of them, it was the beginning of something new, something they were finally ready to embrace.